Did you know that the history of the Spanish Inquisition is not just about torture and death, but about the power of an institution that turned pain into a sacred ritual? Get ready to dive into one of the darkest times in history, where cruelty was legalized in the name of faith. If you're ready to understand the horrors of this era and how pain became a process of salvation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. What would you do if you knew that, for centuries, one of the most powerful institutions in the world, with the support of religion and divine authority, used faith as a justification to inflict endless pain and suffering? While the story of the Spanish Inquisition doesn't begin with a perverse ideology, but with a fervent desire to save souls, or so the Inquisitors claimed. When the Catholic Church assumed the role of absolute arbiter of morality, the line between spiritual justice and physical cruelty began to dissolve. In 1478, the Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, with the papal blessing of Pope Sixtus IV, established the Spanish Inquisition, an institution that would soon become synonymous with pain and fear. The initial idea was simple: to purify the Christian faith. The conversion of Jews and Muslims to Christianity was seen not only as necessary but as a divine obligation. Those who opposed this conversion were not merely disobeying the monarchs but defying the will of God. But something much darker was forming in the shadows of this purification. The Church didn't just want to punish heretics. It wanted to control them, force them to confess sins, real or imagined. And for this, torture would become not only a tool but an institution, a systematic practice to make these sinners repent. Faith, which was supposed to be a source of comfort and compassion, was transformed into a system of oppression. The belief that torture was a legitimate means of purifying the souls of sinners became an accepted dogma. The most macabre part is that the Church did not see this as a perversion of its mission, but as an extension of its divine responsibility. Every scream of pain, every broken bone was, to them, saving souls. In this context, faith became a mask, a convenient justification for cruelty without limits. The belief that torture was a legitimate tool in the Church's work began to take root. The Inquisition system spread with tribunals, inquisitors, and torturers executing their sacred mission in God's name. And the worst part is that all of this was legalized, sanctioned by the very religious authority, at a time when the word of the Church was unquestionable. The story of the Inquisition isn't just about victims. It's also the story of an institution that manipulated faith, turning it into a justification for the most terrible of cruelties. For many, torture was not seen as a mistake but as a sacred tool, necessary for salvation. And while this was happening, the victims, lost in their own pain and despair, found themselves powerless against a machine of suffering powered by a perverted faith, a faith that promised salvation but delivered destruction. The Spanish Inquisition was not an isolated incident or a spontaneous response to heresy. It was carefully planned and engineered, like a true war machine, an institution that operated with the precision and efficiency of a machine, but with one singular purpose: to break the spiritual and physical resistance of the accused. This creation was not just a response to the need to purify the faith, but also an effort to establish absolute control over the bodies and souls of thousands of people. Unlike earlier Inquisitions, which were more localized and disorganized, the Spanish Inquisition became a centralized operation, something never seen before. In 1478, when the Catholic monarchs received papal support, they initiated a meticulously orchestrated plan to monitor, punish, and eliminate any form of religious dissent within their domains. It wasn't enough to just identify heretics. They needed to transform them, make examples of them. Pope Sixtus IV gave the monarchs the power to act as inquisitors, with the authority to investigate, torture, and eventually punish the accused according to divine law. The concept of organized torture soon emerged. It was a systematic operation, with tribunals set up in major cities across Spain and its colonies. Each tribunal operated like a branch of a corporation, with its own inquisitors and torturers, all trained to follow standardized methods and predetermined strategies. Instead of a chaotic and erratic response, there was a clear plan, with precise guidelines on how each accusation should be handled. They were not merely hunting heretics. They were creating a system in which torture became a bureaucratic process, with paperwork, reports, and records. Every act of violence meticulously noted. The standardization of torture methods was one of the most terrifying characteristics of this machine. Each torturer knew exactly what to do, and the victims were no longer treated as individuals but as parts of this control mechanism. Terror spread throughout society. Who could escape this cycle? No one. It didn't matter who you were or what you believed. A simple accusation could be the beginning of a never-ending nightmare of pain. But even more disturbing was that all of this was done with the Church's blessing, which not only tolerated but encouraged this practice with religious fervor. Behind the creation of this suffering machine was the irrational belief that physical pain could purify the soul. The Inquisitors saw their actions as a divine service. They were not just punishing, they were saving souls. This sick logic was what sustained the Inquisition for centuries, keeping it as a legal institution despite the atrocities it committed. What makes the Spanish Inquisition even more terrifying is not just the cruelty of its actions, but the meticulous way in which they were organized. Torture, which could seem like something chaotic and impulsive, was in fact transformed into a highly efficient bureaucratic operation. Inquisitors and torturers followed standardized and strict procedures, as if they were working in a factory of suffering. Each accusation of heresy was treated like a legal process, and the entire torture cycle was documented. The Inquisition wasn't an act of impulsive revenge, but an operation for the systematic production of confessions and punishments. There were tribunals established in various cities, with detailed records of interrogations, torture sessions, the methods used, and of course, the confessions obtained. Every inquisitor had their own goal, much like a corporate executive, and the results were meticulously recorded. The violence was controlled, standardized, and repeatable, a continuous production of pain. To ensure the efficiency of the machine, inquisitors were provided with detailed instruction manuals, which taught exactly how each torture technique should be applied and what the expected standard of confessions was. There was no room for improvisation. Inquisitors used tested methods like the rack, the garuka, the toa, and many other devices, all perfectly described and organized in the manuals. Each technique had its particularities, and the records were kept as carefully as the financial reports of a large corporation. With each confession, the inquisitor made a detailed note, not only about what was confessed, but also about how long it took the victim to break, the variations in pressure and pain, and even the psychological reaction of the accused. These records were used to ensure that the torture process was repeated and improved, creating a kind of feedback where torturers learned from each victim. Pain was measured as a controlled variable, and suffering was maximized according to the established guidelines. When the inquisitor felt that the process was working as planned, they moved to the next step, always maintaining the same operational structure. What seemed like an act of unrestrained violence was, in fact, a cruelty machine designed to be efficient and relentless. This bureaucracy of torture, this detailed organization of human suffering, reveals one of the most disturbing aspects of the Spanish Inquisition. Pain was no longer just an emotional or instinctive reaction, but a science. The Inquisition knew exactly how long a person could endure before breaking, which part of the body would give in first, and how to maximize the psychological anguish during the process. The concept of torture in the Spanish Inquisition was not seen as a violation of human rights or an unforgivable cruelty. On the contrary, it was transformed into something sacred, a divine justice, with the Church's seal of approval. The most perverse aspect of this reality was that the inquisitors genuinely believed they were acting for the good of the accused, that the pain they inflicted was a necessary means to save the souls of those who had strayed from the true faith. This moral and spiritual distortion was what allowed the Inquisition to thrive for so long, operating with a legality that made it almost unquestionable. When Pope Sixtus IV granted power to the Spanish crown in 1478, he not only authorized the Inquisition but validated it as a sacred institution with a divine mission. Torturing someone to extract a confession of heresy, in the eyes of the Church, was not just acceptable, but an act of mercy, an attempt to save the soul of the condemned. The Church justified physical pain as necessary to purify the spirit, a perverse philosophy that became deeply rooted in the mentality of the inquisitors and even the rulers of the time. The Church turned torture into a legally accepted tool that was beyond the reach of conventional morality. There was no room for questioning. If someone was accused of heresy, torture was seen as a natural consequence of the crime, and divine justice had to be fulfilled. Torture became a ritualistic process, a sacrament where the pain of the body was seen as a price to be paid for the purification of the soul. In fact, this legalization of torture turned the Spanish Inquisition into a social control machine. It wasn't just about punishing those who opposed the Christian faith, but also instilling fear in the entire population. The threat of being accused of heresy and suffering the terrible consequences of being tortured was enough to silence any form of opposition, maintaining order and morality as established by the Church. Those who were tortured and then forced to confess were often forced to endorse accusations against others, creating an endless cycle of pain and suffering. Legalized torture was more than just a punishment tool. It was the foundation upon which the Inquisition built its authority. In the name of God, pain and death were administered as a form of justice, making it impossible for the accused to escape the clutches of a system that seemed to have morality and religion as its backing. But, in essence, what the Church was really doing was turning violence into virtue, cruelty into a divine mission, and pain, which should have been a punishment, was now seen as an act of salvation. The true perversity of the Inquisition was not only in its actions but in the way they were legitimized by the Church itself, placing the sacred seal on one of the most brutal forms of torture ever seen in history. One of the most disturbing questions when studying the Spanish Inquisition is, how did ordinary people become relentless torturers, genuinely believing they were fulfilling a sacred duty? The answer lies not in the individual malice of each inquisitor, but in the way the institution and the belief system of the time shaped their minds and actions. The inquisitors were not psychopaths or sadists by nature. They were, for the most part, educated, respectable, and fervently religious. And it was precisely this upbringing that made them so efficient in their task of inflicting suffering. The psychology of the Inquisition was not just about torturing the bodies of victims. It was about controlling their minds, manipulating their beliefs, and ensuring that pain was seen not as a mistake, but as a virtue, as part of a divine process. For the Inquisitors, torture was not a matter of personal pleasure, but of a sacred duty that elevated them morally. They believed they were doing a service to others, and the suffering of their victims was, to them, the assurance that they were saving souls. This is reflected in the training and preparation of the Inquisitors. They were not simply thrown into the fray without preparation. They went through a process of indoctrination. At first, they observed interrogations, then assisted with lighter methods, and over time, became the chief torturers. The routine of torture became as normal as any other administrative task. And the worst part is that, after a long day of torture, the Inquisitors would go home, have dinner with their families, and continue their lives as if nothing abnormal had happened. This emotional detachment, this dissociation between what they did in their everyday lives, was essential for the continuity of cruelty. The most disturbing aspect of this psychology is that the Inquisitors genuinely believed they were doing good. They saw their victims not as people but as cases, as sinners who needed to be purified to achieve salvation. The pain they inflicted was, for them, a part of the divine process, a way to bring the heretics to the truth. This way of thinking was what allowed torture to be carried out with such coldness and efficiency. The process of torture, with its meticulously documented methods and constantly refined techniques, was carried out with the belief that not only would the bodies of the accused be broken, but their souls would also be purified. And that was, for the Inquisitors, the greatest goal. The psychology of an Inquisitor therefore was not based on cruelty for the sake of cruelty, but on a perverse logic where pain and death were seen as necessary for the salvation of a soul. Torture in the Spanish Inquisition was not just an act of random violence, but a scientific practice meticulously developed and perfected over time. The Inquisitors did not act in the dark, nor did they improvise. Each torture technique was tested, documented, and refined with precision, with pain being treated as a variable that could be controlled, measured, and even predicted. Torture thus became a science of pain, where Inquisitors became experts in manipulating human suffering. What makes this even more disturbing is that Inquisitors developed methods to make pain more effective, not just physically but psychologically. They discovered that mental suffering, such as anguish and despair, was often more effective in breaking the spirit than pure physical pain. Torture was transformed into a process with systematic steps, a planned sequence of escalating discomfort, where the victim's mind was constantly forced to question their own reality. Take for example the garrucha, a particularly cruel method of suspension by ropes, where the condemned person's body was slowly raised until their feet barely touched the ground. The physical pain was excruciating, but the Inquisitors knew that the real agony came from time. The victim, suspended for hours, experienced not just pain, but also growing hopelessness. They were trained to understand that the longer the suffering, the more effective the process would be. The psychological despair of not knowing when or if the pain would end was part of the scientific breaking method. Furthermore, Inquisitors used resources like detailed records and timing to optimize their methods. They documented how long an individual could endure in different positions, the psychological effects of each form of torture, and the exact moments when the body and mind's resistance broke. They even invented new torture devices, each more efficient than the last, like the rack, a mechanical device that stretched the victim's body to its limits. It wasn't about causing pain just for the sake of suffering, but optimizing the pain to be more effective in forcing a confession. In many ways, torture was transformed into an industrialized process, where each step was tested and improved, where the effects of pain were analyzed in relation to its efficiency in breaking the accused will. What the Church and Inquisitors saw as a divine process to purify the soul was, in fact, a scientific practice of pain, where the humanity of an individual was no more than a mere variable to be manipulated. The most disturbing part of all of this is that behind every act of torture, there was a mindset of efficiency. They didn't just want the accused to surrender. They wanted the torture process to be as effective as possible, to break the victim quickly, but in a controlled and planned manner. Pain wasn't an accident, nor a byproduct of the process, but the very tool that made the Inquisition machine function. And so, pain became a science, and the science of pain was perfected by Inquisitors, who continued to torture not by impulse, but with meticulous precision. At the heart of the Inquisition machine was a simple but terrifying truth. The survival of any accused person depended on one thing: confession. For the Inquisitors, the truth was irrelevant. What mattered was that the accused confessed, no matter the cost. This cruel cycle of torture and confession created an impossible dilemma for the victims. If they confessed, they might have a chance of survival, but if they maintained their innocence, they were condemned to endless pain. In the end, confessions weren't seen as a matter of revealing the truth, but as a commodity. The more elaborate the confession, the greater the redemption. The psychological pressure on the accused was immense. The Inquisitors didn't just torture physically. They forced the victims to believe that their only way out was confession, even if it meant admitting to crimes they hadn't committed. those who endured the torture sessions the longest. Those who managed to stay firm in their belief that they were innocent were considered the most rebellious and, therefore, the most deserving of punishment. And so, the cycle of suffering continued. Relentless physical and psychological pain until the accused surrendered and offered a confession. Torture wasn't just a means to extract a word. It was a way to mold the accused, to force them to accept a new understanding of reality. For many, confessing was the only way to end the agony. In a torture session, time became irrelevant. Days seemed to stretch into hours, and hours became eternal. Pain became unbearable. With each scream of suffering, the hope for survival faded. The continuous suffering led victims to despair, and the only relief was confession. Confessing meant pain, but it also meant the promise, however illusory, that the pain would end. Many accused, broken by physical and mental pressure, were forced to accuse others, sometimes even inventing stories and crimes they had never committed. The more victims the inquisitors managed to convince, the more efficient the system seemed, the more justice was being done. The Inquisition, unlike a court of law, became a court of pain, where the only possible sentence was suffering and surrender. Even after a confession, the process never ended. The inquisitors used the confessions as a basis for more investigations, more accusations, more torture. Nothing was ever enough. The accused went through this endless spiral of pain and confession, until in the end, nothing human remained in their broken souls. One of the greatest psychological distortions of the Spanish Inquisition was the promise of mercy, a cruel lie that led victims to believe they could be saved, even as they were being destroyed. Inquisitors frequently assured the accused that if they confessed their crimes, they would be forgiven. But this promise of forgiveness was, in fact, a trap. The true intent was never salvation but destruction. Confession did not bring freedom or relief. It merely marked the beginning of another cycle of suffering, deeper and longer than before. For many, the torture was so unbearable that confessing became the only way to end the pain. The inquisitors cunningly manipulated this vulnerability, offering the false hope that by submitting to their will and confessing, they could avoid the worst. But what the church called mercy was a perverse reinterpretation of forgiveness, where forgiveness was only possible through absolute submission and the acceptance of inflicted suffering. The victim who yielded to the promise of mercy often discovered, too late, that confession did not mean a life of freedom. Instead of liberation, confessions led to execution, exile, or, in the best case, a life of permanent surveillance and humiliation. The church and the inquisitors were not concerned with the redemption of souls, but with maintaining absolute control over the bodies and minds of the people. Those who confessed were often burned at the stake, while those who attempted to resist were tortured until they succumbed. Moreover, the mercy offered was highly selective and often applied in a discriminatory manner. The salvation promised was reserved for those who publicly repented, but that was rarely enough to avoid execution. Even those who showed true remorse were often sentenced to death, because in the eyes of the inquisitors, any resistance to divine authority was untenable. The illusion of mercy, then, became one of the most powerful tools of psychological control for the Inquisition, a tool used to make victims believe they had made the right choice, when in reality, they were only digging their own graves. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't limited to torturing in secret, in dark, suffocating rooms. One of the most macabre aspects of the Inquisition was its ability to transform pain and suffering into a public spectacle, a form of entertainment for the masses. Executions, tortures, and trials were not conducted in the shadows. They were staged in public squares, where crowds gathered to watch the suffering of those accused of heresy. The most disturbing part of it all was that these executions were treated as acts of faith, as religious ceremonies, and the public was encouraged to participate, cheer, and even celebrate. These events, known as auto da, were true theatrical productions staged by the Inquisition. The victims were paraded in colorful costumes and symbols of their alleged crimes, walking through the streets while being mocked by the crowd. It was a true display of terror, where the condemned became public figures of shame, forced to confess their sins and show remorse. If they were led to the stake, the execution was accompanied by a religious ceremony, with prayers and hymns, as if death itself was an act of devotion. The auto da wasn't just an execution, it was a tool of social control. The authorities knew that by conducting these events in public squares, they could spread widespread fear. The idea was simple. By showing everyone what happened to those who defied the church, the inquisitors ensured that no one would dare question their authority. This spectacle of pain also served to reinforce the idea that the church was the only source of salvation, and that any form of resistance to its authority deserved public punishment. These events were not just for punishment. They were to teach everyone a painful lesson. Pain was not something that happened in silence, but was displayed, amplified, as a form of religious propaganda. Victims were stripped of their dignity and turned into living symbols of error, while the crowd rejoiced in the execution, often without remorse or empathy. The church turned suffering into a spectacle, showing the world that its authority was absolute and that any violation of its rules would be met with punishment that would instill fear and obedience. By turning pain into a public event, The Inquisition not only terrified its victims but also manipulated the masses, making violence a common and even desirable spectacle. Pain was no longer a private experience but a public show that involved all members of society, creating a continuous cycle of fear, control, and acceptance of cruelty. Although the Spanish Inquisition officially ended in 1834, its legacy continues to echo throughout history, both in terms of psychological and institutional impact. What the Inquisition insidiously taught is that the combination of religious authority, political power, and the moral justification of acts of cruelty can create systems of oppression that last for centuries. This legacy is not limited to the moments of the Inquisition, but resonates in totalitarian regimes, in torture practices conducted in the name of greater causes, and in institutions that place their objectives above human dignity. Throughout history, we've seen how the same type of mentality that sustained the Inquisition was carried into other contexts. Political regimes like Nazism, Stalinism, and even recent practices of torture in the name of ideologies and doctrines followed the logic of the Inquisition. The belief that violence and suffering can be justified if the cause is seen as divine, just, or necessary. The idea that the ends justify the means, that pain can be acceptable if viewed as part of a higher mission, remains one of the greatest tragic lessons of the Inquisition. Furthermore, the Inquisition also left a deep psychological legacy. Those who lived under its rule were marked not only by physical scars, but by the psychological trauma of living in a society where torture and death were always lurking. For many survivors, the pain did not end with the cessation of torture sessions. It continued in their thoughts, in nightmares, in the memories of their destroyed families, and in the sense that they would never be truly free. Society as a whole was traumatized by this cycle of terror, and the scars of this period can still be felt in some cultures and regions where religious or ideological oppression remains a challenge. The most painful lesson, perhaps, is that the mechanisms that allowed the Inquisition to thrive are still present in the modern world. It is not difficult to identify forms of torture, oppression, and psychological control in many contemporary situations. The Inquisition reminds us that, in times of great crisis or collective fear, institutions and governments can justify cruelties in the name of salvation or purification. Even today, suffering caused by institutions claiming to act in the name of a moral or religious cause continues to be a reality, and the history of the Inquisition stands as a dark reminder of how absolute power, combined with a religious justification, can turn torture into something acceptable in the eyes of society. The legacy of the Inquisition is not just historical, it is a constant warning about the dangers of allowing any institution, be it religious, political, or of any kind, to have unlimited authority to determine who lives, who dies, and what is just to do with those who challenge that authority. The suffering of millions of people, carried out in the name of religion, a cause, or an ideology, cannot be forgotten. The Inquisition teaches us that true human freedom and dignity can only be preserved when we separate absolute power from morality and recognize that pain should never be justified as a means to any end. If you were impacted by this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any new videos. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Which aspect of the Inquisition shocked you the most? Your interaction is crucial for us to keep bringing content like this. See you in the next video.